September 21, 2011, Huntsville, Texas. A man sits on death row, minutes away from lethal injection. His name, Lawrence Russell Brewer. When asked what he would want for his last meal, he picked an outrageous mean: a feast of chicken fried steak, fried okra, a triple bacon cheeseburger, a pound of barbecue, half a loaf of white bread, banana pudding, and a pint of ice cream, and he refused to touch any of them. That when he refused to eat it, Texas abolished last meal requests forever. He showed no remorse. His last words were, "As far as regrets, I have none." Then 8 years later, on April 24, 2019, another man walks the same final path. John William King, a self-proclaimed white supremacist covered in racist tattoos, executed for the same crime. He refused to make a final statement, only closing his eyes as the drugs coursed through his veins. 2 executions, 1 life sentence. Why did the state of Texas put these men to death? And why are we covering 2 execution case? To understand, we must go back to the summer of 1998, when the streets of Jasper, Texas ran cold with horror. A time when the South was once again haunted by the ghost of racism. And a man named James Byrd Jr. became a symbol of a nation's shame. Welcome to True Crime Matter, where we uncover the darkest crimes, the final hours, and the truth behind the executions. If you're drawn to stories like this, hit that subscribe button and join us for more real cases that shook the world. It was Father's Day weekend, June 7, 1998, in the small town of Jasper, Texas. James Byrd Jr., a 49-year-old black man, was walking home alone after attending a family gathering. He was less than a mile from his house when a pickup truck pulled up beside him. Inside were 3 white men: Shawn Berry, Lawrence Brewer, and John William King. They offered James a ride. He accepted, not knowing it would be the last ride of his life. Instead of taking him home, they drove him to a remote logging road deep in the woods. That's where the nightmare began. They beat him severely, spray-painted his face, and urinated on him. Then, in one of the most heinous hate crimes in modern American history, they chained his ankles to the back of their pickup truck and began driving. For 3 miles, they dragged James Byrd Jr. down an asphalt road. His body was torn apart. His skin, flesh, and limbs were shredded against the pavement. And yet, for most of the dragging, James was still alive, until his body struck a concrete culvert, decapitating him instantly. The killers didn't stop there. They drove to a black church and dumped the remaining body parts in front of it, as if leaving a twisted, hateful message. Then they went home and had a barbecue. James's dismembered remains were discovered early the next morning by a motorist. Law enforcement arrived to a horrifying scene, a trail of blood, bone, and flesh stretching nearly the length of 48 football fields. By dawn, the gruesome trail had been discovered. A motorist called police after finding a decapitated torso lying near a church cemetery. What investigators stumbled upon next was a scene of unimaginable brutality. A path of blood, body parts, and shredded flesh stretched across rural Huff Creek Road. Immediately, law enforcement knew this wasn't a typical homicide. This was deliberate. This was hate. Within hours, the Texas Rangers and FBI joined the investigation. Evidence was everywhere, and it spoke volumes. At the crime scene, they found a broken chain, a wrench engraved with the name Berry, and cigarette butts. Blood samples, hair, and paint from the truck clung to the road. Meanwhile, in a nearby neighborhood, a local resident tipped off police about a suspicious truck seen earlier, a 1982 Ford pickup. It belonged to Shawn Berry, a 23-year-old local. Police paid him a visit. Under pressure, Berry cracked. At first, he minimized his role. But the forensic evidence told the real story. Blood from James Byrd Jr. was found inside and outside the truck, along with pieces of his remains lodged underneath. Berry also implicated 2 others. Lawrence Russell Brewer, a recently released ex-con and member of a white supremacist prison gang. John William King, a heavily tattooed skinhead known for spreading neo-Nazi propaganda around Jasper. Within 48 hours, All three were arrested and charged with capital murder. The town was stunned, not just by the crime itself, but by the horrifying realization that racist violence hadn't died in the past. It was alive, festering in their own backyard. National news crews flooded Jasper. Civil rights leaders and protesters arrived. And as the investigation deepened, it became clear this wasn't random. It was planned, motivated by racial hatred, and carried out with cold, calculated cruelty. Long before America knew his name, James Byrd Jr. was simply a man trying to live a normal life in Jasper, Texas. Jasper was a small East Texas town of about 7,500 people, bordered by pine trees and haunted by quiet tension. In the late 90s, Jasper was still recovering from its deep, segregated past, a place where black and white families coexisted but didn't truly live side by side. Churches were still divided by race. Neighborhoods, too. And while racism wasn't always loud, it never truly left the room. James Byrd Jr. was 49 years old in the summer of 1998. He was a father, a grandfather, and the third of 8 siblings in a close-knit black family. Born in 1949, James had grown up in the Jim Crow South, attending segregated schools and marching through the struggle of civil rights with his community. He had a passion for music, once played piano at church, and had a soft, deep voice that people remembered long after he left the room. But life hadn't been easy. He battled alcoholism, drifted through jobs, and had been incarcerated for petty crimes in his younger years. Still, he was rebuilding. He was sober. He had recently moved back in with his parents and was trying to get back on his feet. He was known for walking around Jasper, especially when he didn't have money for a cab. People recognized him. He always greeted others with a smile. That's what made what happened next so cruel, so personal, so senseless. But to understand the full story, you also have to look at the men who pulled up beside him that night. John William King was 23 years old. He had grown up in Jasper too, in the same county as James, but he took a much darker path. Arrested for burglary at age 19, he was sent to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, where he became deeply involved with a violent white supremacist gang. While incarcerated, he was tattooed with Nazi symbols, white power slogans, and most infamously, an image of a black man hanging from a tree on his chest. King became obsessed with racial hatred. In his mind, he wasn't just a criminal. He was a soldier in a race war. When he was paroled in 1998, he carried that hate with him back into Jasper. Lawrence Russell Brewer was 31 years old. He had an even longer criminal record, mostly for drug and theft charges, and had also joined white supremacist gangs while in prison. That's where he met King. The two bonded quickly. Brewer was violent, angry, and proudly racist. He had no interest in reforming after release. He was just looking for a reason to strike. Shawn Allen Berry was the youngest, 23 years old. Unlike the others, Berry didn't have tattoos or a long criminal past. He worked odd jobs, owned a pickup truck, and lived with King after prison. Some claimed Berry wasn't like the others, that he wasn't motivated by hate. But he stayed silent during the crime. He drove the truck, and he never called for help. The three men formed an unstable trio, two filled with hate, one too weak to walk away. On June 7, 1998, the three of them had been drinking and riding around late at night when they saw James Byrd Jr. walking home alone. He was less than a mile from his parents' house. They offered him a ride. He accepted, never knowing it would be the last decision he'd ever make. The quiet town of Jasper, Texas, had barely begun to process the horror of James Byrd Jr.'s lynching when the legal firestorm began. Three men were now facing capital murder charges. Charges that, under Texas law, could carry the death penalty. The trials would be split into 3 parts, each held separately to avoid bias. The eyes of the entire country, and much of the world, were now locked on East Texas. First to face justice was John William King. In February 1999, just 8 months after the crime, his trial began at the Jasper County Courthouse. But due to concerns about finding an impartial jury, the venue was moved to Bryan, Texas, roughly 90 miles away. King arrived in court with his arms folded and no trace of remorse. His body was marked with racist tattoos, including one of a black man hanging from a tree. The prosecution didn't need to dig deep. They had letters, drawings, and manifestos filled with hatred. In one, King wrote, "Regardless of the outcome of this, we have made history. Death before dishonor." The evidence was overwhelming. Bloodstains, the chain, and even paint chips from Berry's pickup truck matched to James Byrd Jr.'s injuries. A forensic pathologist testified that Byrd had been alive for nearly 2 miles of the dragging. The jury sat in stunned silence. It took just 2 hours to convict King of capital murder. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Next came Lawrence Russell Brewer. His trial, also moved, this time to Brazos County, began in September 1999. Brewer, a known white supremacist and former inmate, had met King while in prison. Together, they bonded over shared racist ideology and the goal of starting a race war. The prosecution painted Brewer as equally responsible, if not more brutal, than King. Berry, trying to avoid a death sentence, testified that Brewer was the one who wrapped the logging chain around James Byrd's ankles. The defense attempted to claim Brewer wasn't driving the truck and wasn't the ringleader. But the jury wasn't convinced. On September 23, 1999, Brewer too was found guilty of capital murder. His punishment? Death. Then there was Shawn Allen Berry, the man who had originally offered James Byrd Jr. a ride. Unlike the others, Berry did not have a criminal record or known ties to white supremacist groups. Prosecutors believed Berry may not have shared their ideology, but he had driven the truck. He was there. He didn't stop it. But Berry's defense team worked to separate him from King and Brewer. He cooperated with investigators and took a polygraph test, which he passed. And crucially, the prosecution couldn't prove he initiated or planned the murder. In November 1999, Berry was convicted of murder, but not capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 2038. As each man was led out of court, the message was clear. Texas was not going to overlook this crime. The legacy of lynching, of racist terror, had reared its head, and the state responded with the full weight of the law. King and Brewer were transferred to the Polunsky Unit, Texas's death row facility for men, located in Livingston, Texas. There, they would wait under the fluorescent lights, behind solid steel doors, for their turn to face the executioner at the Huntsville unit just 45 miles away. James Byrd Jr.'s family didn't celebrate. They wept. They mourned. They attended every hearing. His sister, Clara Taylor, told the press, "We don't want revenge. We want justice. And we want the world to remember James, not just how he died, but how he lived." What started as a ride home turned into a national reckoning, and for 2 of those responsible, a date with death. On the evening of September 21, 2011, the state of Texas prepared to carry out justice inside the infamous Huntsville unit, also known as the Walls Unit. Behind its red brick walls sat Lawrence Russell Brewer, one of the men responsible for the dragging death of James Byrd Jr. It had been 13 years since the murder that shocked America. Now, Brewer was about to pay for it with his life. As the hour approached, the streets outside the prison filled with protesters, supporters of the Byrd family, and media vans broadcasting live. The victims' families sat quietly in the witness room. They had waited over a decade for this moment. Inside, Brewer was given the usual death row procedure: a final shower, a change into a clean white uniform, and one last meal. But what he requested would become infamous. Brewer ordered a massive feast: 2 chicken fried steaks, a triple bacon cheeseburger, a pound of barbecue, fried okra, a meat lover's pizza, half a loaf of white bread, 3 root beers, peanut butter fudge with crushed peanuts, and a pint of vanilla ice cream. But when the food arrived, Brewer refused to eat any of it. That move angered Texas lawmakers. And within days, the state abolished the last meal request tradition for all death row inmates. As he was escorted to the execution chamber, Brewer showed no remorse. He was strapped onto the gurney, arms extended. A microphone was lowered to capture his last words. But he offered none. Only this chilling statement, made days earlier to a reporter. "As far as regrets, I have none. I'd do it all over again." At 6:21 p.m., the lethal injection began to flow. Within minutes, Brewer was pronounced dead, the first of the three to be executed. Outside, James Byrd Jr.'s son, Ross Byrd, stood quietly. Years before, he had shocked many by saying he forgave Brewer and did not support the death penalty. But the state had made its decision. The execution of Lawrence Brewer marked a turning point in the long and painful legacy of this case. But the story wasn't over yet. John William King was still waiting. Nearly 8 years after Lawrence Brewer was executed, the state of Texas prepared to carry out justice once again. This time, it was for John William King, the man many considered the ringleader behind James Byrd Jr.'s brutal murder. Unlike Brewer, King was defiant to the very end. He never expressed remorse. In fact, until his final breath, he maintained his innocence. Convicted in 1999, King spent 2 decades on death row at the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas. Over those years, he filed appeal after appeal, each one an attempt to stop the clock ticking down on his life. His defense team argued that his original trial attorney failed to present crucial evidence, including claims that King was not present during the actual dragging, and that he had distanced himself from Brewer and Berry before the killing. His final appeal went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, centered on the argument that his trial lawyer had ignored his claims of innocence and failed to properly challenge the state's case. His attorneys stated plainly, Mr. King's jury never heard his side of the story, only the prosecution's version. But the courts weren't convinced. The evidence was overwhelming. Racist letters written by King, drawings depicting lynchings found in his cell, his well-documented ties to white supremacist prison gangs, and the fact that James Byrd Jr.'s blood was found on King's clothes and shoes. Despite his appeals, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld his conviction. And on April 24, 2019, the execution was finally scheduled. The final 24 hours. On his last day alive, John William King woke up at 6 a.m., escorted under heavy guard. He was moved from death row in Livingston to the Huntsville unit, where Texas carries out all executions. He spent the morning under suicide watch, monitored every 15 minutes by guards. He was not asked to choose a last meal, so he was given the standard prison meal: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a roll. This was because his friend they committed the murder together made Texas change its law on asking prisoners to choose their last meal. There were no visitors, no family present, and no final statements released to the public. He remained cold, silent, and emotionless in his final hours. At 6:56 p.m., King was led into the death chamber, strapped to the gurney. A crowd of protesters and Byrd family supporters stood outside the prison walls, waiting for the announcement. When asked if he had any final words, King declined. No apology, no confession, no remorse. At 7:04 p.m., the lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered. Within minutes, his chest stopped moving. He was declared dead at 7:08 p.m. Watching through the glass were members of James Byrd Jr.'s family, including his sister, Clara Taylor, who whispered a prayer as King took his final breath. Outside, reporters read the news live. John William King, executed for the 1998 dragging death of James Byrd Jr., has been put to death by the state of Texas. With King gone, 2 of the 3 men responsible for James Byrd Jr.'s murder were now executed. Only Shawn Allen Berry, the man who cooperated with authorities, remained, serving a life sentence at the Ramsey Unit in Rocheron, Texas. James Byrd Jr.'s legacy lives on through laws passed in his name, including the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, signed into federal law in 2009. But for the Byrd family, the scars never fully healed. Justice, yes, Closure, maybe. Forgiveness. That's something only the heart can decide.